If I were to ask you what decades you think all of these clips are from, what would you say? Maybe some from the 80s, some from the 90s. Maybe some of them look distantly familiar, like you might have seen them once on TV as a child. It all feels like it belongs to a different era, but none of it is more than a few years old. In fact, none of it is older than 2020. This is all new media made to look old. Brand new technology, brand new artists, purposely manufacturing this dated aesthetic. It's not a new phenomenon. I'm just not sure there's ever been this much of it. It feels like I see this literally everywhere I look now, more and more every day. Especially when it comes to horror. You've probably noticed it too. Horror games compressed down to a scattering of heinously dithered pixels, creepy films full of forgotten cartoons and old-timey music. At first, I thought it might just be a sort of fad, a phase indie horror was going through. But the more I see it, the more I get the feeling these memories are at home in horror. Somehow, this sense of nostalgia just makes more sense in the darkness. After all, isn't that where ghosts belong? Nostalgia horror is a pretty broad term. It's not really a genre per se, it's more of a treatment. It's mascot horror, analog horror, liminal horror, anything that in any way tries to look old and also tries to be scary. Which is, of course, subjective. We made a whole video just trying to wrap our heads around the expansiveness of this phenomenon last year, but even that barely scratches the surface. Maybe the easiest way to navigate this space is to think of it as a spectrum. How intentional is the nostalgia element? How much at play is that in defining the purpose of the work? On the one end, you have game developers like Puppet Combo, the studio behind runaway hits like Babysitter Bloodbath and Nun Massacre. Just from those names alone, you can probably smell the intent. Their games all have this PlayStation 1 style and cover art meant to look like old slasher movie VHS cases. These scream nostalgia. Their core conceit is that they are, in the modern age, in an accessible and interactive format, calling back to another time. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have developers like this guy, Yames. You might have seen some popular Let's Play channels trying out his games Growing My Grandpa and Discover My Body. They both made waves a few years back for their sheer weirdness, a large part of which is their distinctive look. I say these games are on the opposite end of the spectrum of intentionality from Puppet Combo because they just don't feel very intentional. I mean, they do consistently look old, but in a different sort of way. Less like they're calling back to a specific point in time and more like they're just displaced altogether. Corrupted and crunched and twisted until they look almost like a caricature of an old, damaged game. Like they were left out in the rain and the graphics themselves have started to mold. It's hard to imagine accomplishing a look like this on purpose. I'm talking about intent here because I think it's really important for understanding what's going on with this kind of horror. There are tons of good reasons for making something like this. Many of them are very practical from a development standpoint. It's easier to create visuals like this. There's less of an expectation for perfection when the whole game looks outdated to begin with. The low-res style provides a certain ambiguity that allows the audience to use their imagination. All very good reasons to choose to do this, and you can see those clever applications shine when you play these games. But there's this feeling you get when you play titles like Yames's. This feeling that it isn't just a choice. It's not just practical. It's almost a force imposing itself on creators.
That's definitely not uncommon for game devs to draw on the past. You don't have to have something that's like looking like a AAA video game. You can make something out of pixel art, and like maybe it'll be 2 colors, right? Like maybe it'll just be black and white, and that's a lot easier to create assets for than full 3D stuff that takes a full advantage of all like modern console and PC graphics stuff.
That was James. I wanted to make sure I wasn't seeing things. I wanted to see what it was like for him creating art of this nature. So I talked to him about it. And a lot of those more practical considerations are there, but I think it's telling that not even he has a really good explanation for why this works so well, or why he feels so drawn to it. With Puppet Combo, I at least understand the intent. The past can be uncomfortable. We're supposed to be afraid of ghosts. The conceit is clear. With James, it's just raw, old, weird, broken stuff. There's not a lot of sense to it, just vibes. Although, he did use one term that stuck with me while we were talking. Something weirdly appropriate for studying a field of digital ghosts. Hauntology. If you're an academic, you probably get that wordplay pretty much immediately. Ontology is the philosophical study of being, of existence. Hauntology is the study of things that used to exist in the past, and which now, for whatever reason, have begun to exist again in the present, as if called back from beyond the grave. Despite its relative obscurity, this is not a niche field of study. In a world that appears to be increasingly built for ghosts, hauntology becomes a default study, one you almost can't avoid. It's also nothing new. The Victorian era was also an especially haunted period. People of that time, especially in Western Europe, seemed particularly interested in reviving the past. There was a renewed fascination with Greek and Roman philosophy. Shakespeare had a huge resurgence in popularity. Much of the art and poetry from that era expressed less interest in modernity than in idyllic scenes of bygone ages. We're all familiar with the tropes of Victorian romance. As long as there have been people, those people have missed their pasts, fantasized about pasts they never got to experience. But it does sort of seem to me like the fixation is maybe a little out of hand these days. Don't you sometimes get the feeling that pop culture has kind of stalled out? That the developments that do occur are happening at such a minute level that they're almost impossible to detect? At least for the Victorians, the innovations felt like innovations. The light bulb and the phonograph and the telephone were all huge leaps forward. Those were things that blew people's minds. Those were things that represented complete paradigm shifts. When was the last time you felt something like that? When TikTok came out? When the Cybertruck was unveiled? Humanity is still making incredible leaps and bounds all the time. It's just not as much a part of the zeitgeist. Real innovations are quieter these days. It's hard to make a headline out of RNA vaccine variant 5,000,001, even if it's already saving lives. There's a real, very well-justified sense that the sensational stuff, crypto, Web3, generative AI, TikTok, the Cybertruck, are just not real. They're pretty incentives for shareholders. They're exciting to hold press conferences about, but they don't feel like progress. They feel like technological bloat, almost at humanity's expense. I think, in general, there's a strong pining for a world and a future that does feel real. One that's not just sensational. A future that's genuinely exciting. One with actual paradigm shifts. And so, we see humans trying to relive the old dreams, making better wrist communicators and tricorders and cars with doors that open like the ones in Back to the Future. Every horror channel on YouTube uses damaged VHS-style effects and old stock music. Every old aesthetic is repackaged and sold online as dreamcore or weirdcore or some other core. I do actually like a lot of this stuff, but how long can you keep doing it? How long before you just run out of nostalgia? If it's the 80s and 90s right now, what will you be nostalgic for in another 30 years. If everything that's memorable about this period is actually just the same stuff that was memorable about 30 or 40 years ago, what then? Will it just be another, even more skewed 80s revival again in the future? It's like a game of telephone, except you're playing it with your memories. Each pass between generations changes them. Slowly, they become harder and harder to recognize. Slowly, you lose the memory of what you were even supposed to be nostalgic for. In his 2020 book, Hauntology, The Ghosts of Future Past, Merlin Coverley argues that nostalgia has become so deeply ingrained in today's postmodern culture that it's made itself redundant. He says that the present can no longer be experienced as anything other than the sum of its pasts. A game of telephone, if I've ever seen one. And if that is what's happening, if nostalgia itself is steadily becoming more redundant and less meaningful, then, he suggests, the natural trajectory of society would be toward a completely post-nostalgic culture. One divested from the ability to even experience nostalgia at all because you simply haven't had enough distance from any one memory to feel nostalgic for it. If they never leave, you can't miss them, and you can't bring them back. They just keep drifting around years past their prime, unable to pass into obsolescence. Digital ghosts. Simon Reynolds, the author of the book Retromania, put this really well. He says that culture is decelerating while technology is accelerating. Cutting-edge music production equipment used to make songs that sound like they're from the 80s, modern game engines like Unity and Unreal put to work building games that would look at home on the Nintendo 64. All of this bright, shiny new tech to play with, used to make stuff that looks and feels old. And often, by association, pretty uncomfortable, too. The horror sort of just emerges from this process, quite naturally. Here's a particular case you might have heard of. Back in 1988, Pixar created a short film called Tin Toy. It was originally supposed to be a tech demo meant to play at conventions and trade shows to show off the kind of animation their studio was capable of. Back in the 80s and 90s, this animation was incredibly lifelike. People couldn't fathom how Pixar had managed to pull something like this off. Looking at it now, isn't it sort of creepy? I do not enjoy looking at that baby. Honestly, the only reason the toys look sort of alright is because they're supposed to look like they're made of plastic. This wasn't intended to be a horror film, but purely as a consequence of time passing, it became one. I remember seeing a quote from Brian Eno floating around a few years back that touches on this. He says, "Whatever you find weird, ugly, uncomfortable, and nasty about a new medium will surely become its signature. CD distortion, the jitteriness of digital video, the crap sound of 8-bit, all of these will be cherished and emulated as soon as they can be avoided. It's the sound of failure. So much modern art is the sound of things going out of control, of a medium pushing to its limits and breaking apart." Remember that song from the start of the video? You've probably heard it before. It's pretty much everywhere right now. It's kind of a meme at this point. But I don't know that many people know what it's from. It's Just a Burning Memory is the first song off of a series of albums by an artist known simply as The Caretaker. Everywhere at the End of Time is 6 albums long, and every song is an edited version of a different public domain jazz number. The songs get more distorted as the albums progress, until finally you can barely recognize a tune through all the static. The Caretaker created Everywhere at the End of Time to reflect a losing battle with dementia. At the end of your life, the only thing you have left to hold on to, the only thing you can remember clearly, is your youth. When this project first dropped, people were calling it unlistenable. Not because it was bad, but because it was so emotionally devastating. I even heard people calling it the first true horror album. Clearly, Everywhere at the End of Time is a deeply hauntological piece. It takes something old and reworks it to be new. But it's not scary because it's hauntological. It's scary because it knows that it is. Hauntological pieces aren't inherently creepy on their own. I'm not running for the hills every time I see someone posting about Y2K fashion or listening to electro swing. But I get bored really, really bored. I think this is pretty universal, right? I mean, I don't think anyone is thrilled to see Despicable Me 4 or another Ghostbusters reboot. When Ready Player One came out, a movie stuffed to the gills with old pop culture references, everyone made fun of the constant nostalgia plugs for being cheap and obnoxious. Nobody really wants this. And I think that's something the artists behind nostalgia horror are tapping into, whether they realize it or not. Do you really want to live in a world where all of the songs are trying to sound like one really popular song from 20 years ago? Do you want all of your video games to look and feel exactly the same as they did when you were a kid? The nostalgia itself isn't what's uncomfortable here. It's the idea that the only thing left to engage with on a cultural level is nostalgia. It's scary to be surrounded by ghosts. Seeing all of these things recycled all the time really does feel like some kind of weird cultural séance, a conjuring of spirits. So, when the horror artists take these zeitgeists and put them into the context of actual horror, it feels fitting. As if to say, we know this isn't an act of remembrance. We know it's not just nostalgia. We know it's a haunting. And I'm afraid that's all for this week. Our next video will be coming out in a week from now, so I'll see you then. Unless, of course, you don't want to wait. We've actually made a ton of stuff that isn't up here on YouTube, like this video about the morphology of angels and why artists always give them wings, or this one about artificial life as a magic system. We even made a whole original series over there called Worldsmiths about our favorite authors and the unique landscapes of their minds. And, of course, if you just don't want to wait, next week's YouTube video is actually already out and ready to be watched. That's right. You can watch it right now, ad-free, along with everything else I just mentioned, over on our streaming platform, Nebula. YouTube is kind of a crazy place to make content. Don't get me wrong, I'm happy to have this platform, but you have to be so careful about your topic choices, your packaging, what you include in your videos. You just start to feel like you're walking on eggshells. Nebula doesn't have any of those concerns. It's an entirely different environment, devoid of all the weird YouTube cynicism. The entire platform was built by creators for creators. Every time you watch a video there, a creator you love is getting paid, and far more than they would ever get paid on YouTube. And on top of that, Nebula even helps its creators to fund incredible original content. You know, like our series, Worldsmiths. And we're not the only ones who have been busy over there. So many other amazing creators have started creating and sharing their own unique stuff on Nebula, like our friend Frankie from the channel A Bit Frank, or Tim from the channel Hello Future Me. Heck, there's even a high-production, independently run sci-fi audio drama over there called The Sojourn, which is just so good. I've been listening to it while working lately and loving every second of it. Nebula is just a really unique, fun, fresh environment. It kind of makes watching videos on the internet fun again. Speaking of which, here's the really fun part. Nebula is already cheaper than almost any other streaming platform on the internet, like $3 per month. That cheap. But we also do something that most platforms will never do. We give you the option to pay once and have Nebula for life. Just $300 one time and you never have to pay again. No matter how big the platform gets, how fancy the content gets, you can pay for this once and have access to it forever if you want to. All you have to do is click the link in the description or go to go.nebula.tv/TaleFoundry and sign up for 1 year. That's it. Again, that's just $3 a month or $300 one time to get access for life. Frankly, I'm not quite sure how they can afford to do all this, but I'm definitely not complaining. Seriously, take advantage of this offer while it's still going. I don't think any better one exists in the world of streaming. Anyway, that's all for this one. Thanks for watching and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next week. Bye.